I'm really happy to introduce our next guest. James MacDonald Reid is a Highland-born bagpiper and Gaelic storyteller whose work bridges music and oral tradition. He is a lifelong student of Scotland's piping heritage. He has performed widely on Highland, Lowland, and border pipes, and is known for bringing epic Gaelic tales to life with music. I was very lucky to meet Mr. Reid in Belarus when I organized the first Bagpipe Festival in Hlibokaya, 2017. He kindly agreed to come to Belarus and perform there. It was the first edition of the festival. And the second time, I was even luckier to visit him in Edinburgh last autumn with my wife. We had a wonderful afternoon and evening in Edinburgh together, speaking about bagpipes, Scotland, and different things. So we are also lucky to host him here today. Um, Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Nothing that.
As a pretext to our meeting, we had a small conversation on Facebook about Belarusian bagpipes and publications about them in Western books. And you mentioned a book, Bagpipes by Anthony Baines, Oxford University Press, 1960. And in your comment, you said, my father bought this book for me in 1960 when I was 12 years old. I read it through over and over again and had it almost memorized by the time I was 14. It inspired me to take French and Russian at school and then to set out across Europe to find players of all of these bagpipes: Croatia, Serbia, Macedonia, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Czechia. I did that from 1968 to 1970, but I didn't manage to get to the Soviet Union until 1974, Italy 1975, and France later still. And I said that it would be a good introduction to our conversation within this new podcast program. So can you please tell us a little bit more about this book, about your beginnings and how you explored bagpipes to begin with?
The book was quite an eye-opener for me. I had an older brother who was also interested in um, Slavic music, particularly. And I had a music teacher at my school who used to bring around records of Macedonian, Bulgarian, Serbian, Croatian music, and so on. So I got a deep interest in that. And I often found that my Highland Scottish Gaelic culture had much more in common in many respects than it did with English culture, for example. Um, so I naturally latched onto this. I saw parallels, and the book itself, the Baines book, introduced me to places like Slavonia or indeed Slovakia, and it encouraged me to learn more about those countries. Uh, And I also realized that if I took Russian at school, it would give me access to their languages. So in 1968, when I managed to get there, um, going into Serbia, for example, uh, I would use Russian because most people took Russian at school. So I was still a teenager, and other teenagers had taken Russian, so they would use this as a means of communicating. But then we'd be drinking together, they'd chat among themselves, and I would realize that their languages were fairly accessible. Counting in particular, you learn one Slavic language how to count, the others are pretty clear. So went from there, and then I would just hear from conversations of other teenagers uh, what they would say in a particular instance. And then I would work out how that meaning was. There were no grammar books available of Serbian or there was of Serbian. There wasn't of Macedonian or Bulgarian or Slovak. And so I just had to guess. Um, I managed to get a small dictionary, which was, I think, Bulgarian to English. I couldn't get English to Bulgarian. I got a Serbo-Croatian dictionary that fell to pieces. I kept having to put the pages back inside. And then later I got a grammar book. But the most interesting thing to me was that I would go to folklore festivals, the only Scottish person there, in places like Opatia in Croatia, Pleven in Bulgaria. And I would meet the other bagpipe players and we would exchange information. They were interested in what I did, and I was interested in what they did. I remember a festival in what was it, Skopje in 1968, and there was a group from Czechia, a Czech group there from Pilsen, the Pilsen ensemble, and there was a Czech bagpipe, dudi, or the pukul as they called it, on the ground. And I was looking at it because it was like the one in the Anthony Baines book. It was the first time I saw one close up. And then the player came over, introduced himself to me, Václav Švík. We spoke in Russian, and we're still friends to this very day.
Well,
I visited him later that year, and he took me to Jakub Konradi, the maker in Domažlice, who had an unfinished one, and that's how I got mine.
so bagpipes were a pretext for that exploration from the beginning. It's not the other way around that you visited those countries and were inspired by the culture, but you already came there as a practicing bagpiper. Am I getting it right?
Yes, and even before I went, I managed to find a player in Seattle, of all places, the west coast of America. I went there to perform at festivals, and I found a player who had a Macedonian bagpipe. And so he taught me the fingering, and I realized how to use the murmurka, the little flea hole at the top. But in the Baines book, it was well illustrated, so I got the idea behind it. Therefore, when I went there, I already had um, insight into how to play it, and I managed to get one in a small shop in a back street of Skopje. I had very little money then. I was hitchhiking largely to travel and sleeping out where I could, but Western currency was so much more valuable than Eastern currency at that time. That gave me an advantage. And another thing um, that really struck me early on, and that is that in later years, when I go back there, people talk about how difficult life was under the communist regimes of Bulgaria and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and so on. Yugoslavia, not so bad. But they would say to me, weren't you in danger? Didn't you not have a lot of trouble with us? And I said, quite the reverse. Because when I came across military people or police, they were so intrigued that a teenager from Scotland was there that they used to help me out. I can distinctly remember going to a village in Macedonia, very isolated, and I was required to go to the local police and register as a foreigner. And I did so, and they immediately said, well, what on earth
Yeah.
inspired you to come here? And I said, I'm interested in the Gaida. And the policeman immediately said, my uncle plays it. Would you like to come around to dinner tonight and introduce you? So, no, even in Czechoslovakia, I was there during the Warsaw Pact invasion, and I never felt unsafe. And I think simply because they were so um, conscious of not having a bad image to the West,
Mhm.
that um, anytime there was an incident which might give them a bad light. For example, I saw some young fellows being harassed by the police late at night in the railway station in Sofia. And as soon as they realized that I was a Westerner, they left them alone. So I maybe have been too bold, but I got this feeling very early on that the authorities there weren't going to give me a hard time, and they never really did.
It, it's very interesting because for Central Europe and people with this mentality, they usually associate free traveling with the Schengen zone and European Union, which is not the same. And they assume that traveling started somewhere in the 90s, maybe later. They don't realize that it was also possible in the 60s, in the 70s, and some people even studied abroad. Some people from Belarus studied in Czechoslovakia before World War II, for example. So people traveled as much as they do now. Um, I
I think
wanted to.
the people there found it difficult to travel. For example, Bulgarians found it difficult to travel outside of the Soviet uh, zone, and Slovaks did, Czechs and Slovaks. Well, but the folk ensembles I met, they could travel. So, for example, I went to a folklore festival in the Netherlands in Snake, 1968, and there was a group from Slovakia there, from Mijava, and I exchanged addresses with them, and then later came to visit them. But it came as a surprise because I was unable to contact them in advance. I just arrived there out of the blue, but they were able to travel with the folk ensembles. And the same, the Pilsen ensemble managed to travel to France, and they brought my bagpipe when it was finished with them to France to deliver it to me.
So
So
this
I
was
was
a.
able to travel, but they weren't always themselves. I did
Uh,
have a bit of trouble at one point, and that was when I went from Yugoslavia to Czechoslovakia, specifically to Slovakia. I had to cross Hungary, which wasn't a problem. But when I hit the border of Czechoslovakia, because of the Warsaw Pact invasion, they wouldn't allow me to enter, even though I had a visa. And so I could only go back to Yugoslavia, but I was stuck there because I didn't have a transit visa to return through Hungary. Consequently, I had to stay on the border for a while until some soldiers smuggled me onto a train. It was Hungarian soldiers helped me get onto a train that was going to Vienna. So I went to Vienna. I went to the Czechoslovak embassy and they put me up and I helped them translate some letters. Uh, and then they asked if I would go back into Czechoslovakia. I said I would. So they smuggled me in through Petržalka
Mhm.
and gave me some assignments. I was to go to Bratislava and phone a man and tell him where his daughter was. I'd memorized what to say in Slovak. And then I went to Prague after that and met up with a university professor called Karel Babchitsky to help smuggle him and his wife and children out of Czechoslovakia before the Soviet authorities caught up with them. And I did that with the help of the Pilsen ensemble, who they traveled with them on their trip to France, pretending to be part of the ensemble.
Mhm. Unbelievable. Um, I
It was a
wanted
lot of
to.
fun. It was a lot of fun. And if I ever got caught during all that, I'm sure all they'd have done was made me leave the country. I don't think I'd have been arrested. I think. I
I,
may
I
be
want
wrong.
I wanted to ask you about bagpipes and storytelling because you're also famous for to be a storyteller. You come from a Gaelic-speaking Highland community and are deeply rooted in Gaelic storytelling. So, how did this heritage shape your approach to telling stories, and how did the bagpipe become part of that journey? Do you mix the two? Because in Belarus, I just mentioned that when you played in Hlibokaya, you also agreed to sing in Gaelic, which was part of your performance. And I guess you told us some stories too. So it was like a mixture performance. Uh,
Well, for me, they're always deeply connected. All of these are interconnected. And if anything, that was my life's work. Um, when I came back to Scotland in 1970, the first thing I did was I found a place to stay in Edinburgh. Just, in fact, it was a cellar of somebody. I had to sleep in a wee cellar with no electricity and a little coal fire. But I found other people with my kind of background, people who were brought up Gaelic speaking, who came from a culture where they heard stories, they danced, sang, all of these together. And my life's work has been trying to reconnect these. I must say it hasn't been very successful because the authorities in Scotland, well, particularly at that time, they were always directed from England. And in England, the arts are separated. You have the Arts Council and it has a dance department. And the dance department people know nothing about music. That's an alien culture to them. The music people know nothing about dance. The storytelling people know. So they don't know how these are interconnected. And so even now, when I'm performing on the Edinburgh Fringe, I tell the stories, but I play the music and sing the songs that are connected to them. So I did a big revelation just last week, doing a show where I told two stories, very long ones. The first one is 45 minutes to tell. The second one is 15 minutes to tell, but they're connected with classical bagpipe tunes. But the bagpipe societies who promote these tunes don't know that there are stories connected with them. And they get these big discussions and conferences where they're trying to figure out where the titles come from, but they don't speak Gaelic themselves. So they don't realize that the titles that they're using are mistranslated or they're only partially translated. So, for example, the 45-minute tale that I told last week is called Ca Galavach na Njóin, the Desperate Battle of the Birds. And the Pibroch Society only knows it in translation, the Desperate Battle of the Birds. So they have conferences where they're trying to figure out which birds are fighting. Is it blackcocks? Is it or something? If they heard the tale, which they never have, they'd realize it's actually a battle between the birds and the beasts. And it only occurs in the beginning of the story that goes on to all kinds of other places. Another simple example is there's a very well-known pibroch, which they call the big spree. Now, a spree is a word in English which means maybe when you go out and get drunk for an evening. But the original title, they only in their book, they have the Gaelic title, An Dúrach Mór. An Dúrach, the spree. So Dúrach is when you go out, have a nice party or something like that, and maybe have a lot of alcohol. Mór means big, so it is indeed the big spree. But they only got an abbreviated title. The full title, Han Dúrach Mór or Bjarla de Hatal, which in effect means you're drunk, you need to go to sleep. But they won't listen to people like me. They carry on in their little separate world where storytelling is an alien thing to them, dance is an alien thing to them. They have all kinds of dances, and there's a big Scottish traditional dance trust. And I've been fighting them for decades, trying to get them to listen that I know the background to the dances and their meaning and their connection with stories, their connections with different songs and music. But none of them know that. Not even the university does. And 2 years ago, I applied for a residency at Edinburgh University, specifically in the Celtic department, which used to be called School of Scottish Studies. And it was to be a folklore, folk culture residency. I applied and said that I would like to do the residency to bring the connections, to help the students understand how these are all interconnected. And in the mind of people brought up in the folk culture, they're inseparable. They didn't even interview me. They gave the job to a jazz musician who uses a computer. And what he did was he went through their archives of different songs and music and sampled them in the computer and then made collages out of them that have no meaning at all. It's as if he'd taken food and put it in a blender.
Mhm.
And so what
Without
does that?
having access to the beginning, or having the
He doesn't.
access to having the access to the language as well, knowing the
Oh, he
language.
doesn't understand. So he gets these recordings of people singing songs 50 or 60 years ago or telling stories. He doesn't know, he doesn't understand them, he doesn't know what they mean. He'll get different ones of musicians playing tunes, and then he just scrambles them together and makes a salad out of them, a sort of sound salad. What? So, anyway, I don't know if this will ever be resolved because the only other people I knew who were in the same aim, a good example being Patrick McNeil. He didn't understand the dance and he didn't play the pipes, but he understood the storytelling and the songs and how they're interconnected. He was excellent. He died a year ago, very frustrated because no one would accept him. He hadn't gone to university. I haven't either. So I don't know what's going to come of this. I think this will go with me to my grave. I'll be 77 tomorrow, and in 2 weeks I have an operation for cancer, an 8-hour operation. So I don't know what's going to come of this. I've got some people I've been trying to train in this, but none of them play the bagpipes or dance or anything. So they're and none of them, oh yeah, one of them is a fluent Gaelic speaker. The other two are only partial speakers. So I think we're entering an era when everything is done through electronic gadgets and folk culture is probably gone.
It's a very important message, especially in the context of Central Europe and revivals, national revivals, maybe not even Central, but Eastern Europe. How the knowledge of the languages was connected to the revivals in Belarus and other countries. Um, can we say a few words about different types of Scottish bagpipes? Because we mostly associate it with Highland pipes, but you also play border pipes and small pipes. Can you say a few?
I never used the term border pipes. I
Yeah,
never heard that term until the 1980s when we'd started a Lowland Piper Society in the 70s, and then it became more popular in the 1980s, but they didn't like the word lowland. So they started using the term border. But I don't recall it being used before then. I may be wrong, but I don't.
I see. So
And in
Highland
fact,
and Lowland, we can stick to these names,
yeah,
right?
or what was often used, because I knew the makers back then, and they were made in many cases by the same people. So, for example, J&R Glens made both, and they made them in different sizes. And I used to know them quite well. They weren't called Glen anymore. Their name was Ross. It was Andrew Ross the older and Andrew Ross the younger. And a fellow who worked as a turner for them was called Archie Rowan. So I would hang out with them all the time. But they would refer to them as bellows pipes and mouth-blown pipes. And customers would come in and they say, I'd like a lowland pipe, so okay, with bellows. But in actual fact, they would use exactly the same dimensions for these bellows pipes, which were called lowland pipes, for the drones. They would use the same drone dimensions as they would on half-size Highland pipes. So there was a crossover between them. And I've only in recent years, with the help of some others who are doing research into lowland pipes, mostly English people who moved up to Scotland, but very studious and very, very helpful. We're finding crossovers. For example, there are some carvings of pipers from the 16th and 17th centuries in central Scotland, where it's on the verge of the Highlands, but it's really in the lowlands. So it's areas where the community spoke in Scots, lowland Scots, not in Gaelic, but they would be familiar with the Gaelic culture. It would they would have workers who spoke Gaelic among themselves.
Mhm.
They would go to marketplaces where they would mix them. They go to cattle sales and so on. So there was a crossover in Stirlingshire, particularly, and parts of Lowland Perthshire. I'm thinking Glenalmond in particular, where it was a Scots-speaking community. In my own ancestry, I have an ancestor on a part of my family that's entirely Highland. They're all Argyll people in that end, but there's one person with a Lowland name, a man called Andrew Eadie, Eadie, and he came from a village called Buttergask in Strathallan, very near the Highlands, but it is in the Lowlands. I found his baptism certificate from 1724, and it says Andrew Eadie, son of John Eadie, piper in Buttergask.
Oh, wow.
So we discussed this among ourselves. What sort of bagpipe did he have? And according to this, what we've got in carvings and remnants, it seems to have been they played them in that area with the drones going across the arm rather than over the shoulder.
Like in some traditions in Central
Yes,
Europe.
but that's handy for using bellows because you can tune the drones without unstrapping the bellows. But they seem to have been mouth blown. We haven't got that conclusive yet, but I think there's more of a crossover than many people realize.
Hmm.
And of course, in early records, it states it seems to indicate that in places like Argyll, where they didn't have patronage of pipers so much as they did farther north, but the pipers there seem to have used two tenor drones and no bass drone. And I found a painting, a portrait from the late 1700s, early 1800s, in a house in Argyll of a piper dressed not in Highland clothing. He's just wearing a black jacket. He's wearing breeches, not a kilt. And he's playing a very professionally made bagpipe, black wood. Maybe it was dyed with ink, as I've got an old set that was. So, but professionally made with white, possibly ivory mounts, no bass drone, two tenors. And it's a very professionally done painting, so it's not an error. So,
Two drones. It had two drones, right? This
yes,
pipe.
but tenors, no bass.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this seems to have been very common in that part of Scotland in that era. So there's a lot more variety going on, I think, and small pipes with and without bellows. I've got a mouth blown set and a bellows blown set. So
Does it have any connection to Ireland? Because in Ireland they also had some pictures with two drones. I'm not sure whether they called it a war pipe,
I think
but
I think this term war pipe is a mistake because in Scottish Gaelic it's called peep vor meaning big.
yeah.
But when you get it's called a lenited M, where m becomes v in a feminine adjective.
Mm-hmm.
But in Ireland, they pronounce that as a w sound. So in Irish Gaelic, the word vor is pronounced war. And I think
Oh,
it's a mistake from English speakers who didn't understand it. It's simply the Irish word for big.
okay. So then it's like it works like in Bulgarian tradition, Kaba and Jura, right?
Yes,
Closer to this.
yes, just big and small. Um, Peep Vec is what you call the little pipe, and the big one's called Peep Vor. As simple as that. There's also an expression which I find quite fun. The Gaelic word for bellows is siolnach, which is almost identical to siúnach, a word for a fox. And there's a Gaelic expression which is there's meat and music here, said the fox when he ran away with the bagpipe. But when I heard it in Gaelic, with the bellows pipe, because it's the pun of siúnach and siúnach. So it's the connection of that. Another point I might bring up here, which I discussed in Bulgaria a lot, and I haven't said much here in Scotland because I don't have any status in Scotland at all. I never went to university. I kept applying and applying, but I had bad schooling records. But I had bad schooling records because my family moved around a lot when I was a child, and I learned more folklore. So I didn't attend a lot of school. But I think that the West Highland bagpipe tradition came from a different source from the Lowland bagpipe tradition. Because if you look in early carvings of bagpipes, you find them around the east of Scotland, in the cathedrals in particular, and they're very much the standard European type. So they tend to have bass drone and maybe a baritone, rather like the German, Dutch, English types, or some of the earlier French types. They may not have been living players. It could have been because a lot of the carvers came from Europe. So they may have been just following a tradition they already had, or maybe it wasn't necessarily local pipers. We don't know. And we don't have much early reference to these in written records. So the carvings in the cathedrals are possibly a little bit on the early side. However, we don't get references to them in the West Highlands until the 15th century. And they come in very quickly, and almost immediately they have patronage from West Highland chiefs. And the names that are used are not indigenous Gaelic names. Now, at the time, in the 15th century, there was a massive trade from the West Highlands, particularly Argyll, but a bit farther north as well, the MacDonald and MacLeod chiefs, also the Macleans. They traded with the city of Galway in the west of Ireland, major port, and they brought in a lot of wine from Spain. And we have all these songs. This is the handy thing about knowing the Gaelic songs, because they talk over and over again about, and we will drink the red wine from Spain that we got in Galway.
Mm-hmm.
I think that these bagpipes that suddenly emerge at that period in the West Highlands came from northwest Spain, from Galicia. Their structure is identical, and the words around them, like peep, seem to have come from that source. We also have a very strong influence in the dance at that period, which comes from northwestern Spain. So there's a major trade route. They in turn got salt fish from us, and even silver, strangely enough, because Spain is a big silver mine. But there was a lot of silver worked, particularly in Islay and in central Argyll at that time, which was very popular in Spain. So a lot of it was shipped off there. So it's something I haven't published, and I've discussed late at night with various academics, but we haven't
Very
pursued that.
interesting. Very interesting, because most people would assume that you distribute certain cultural phenomena from something bigger, but based on our today's knowledge and situation, it would be Scottish bagpipes, the most famous. But you claim that it's the kind of the other way around, speaking about the Celtic world, Galicia, but not only Galicia, but
I
also.
think calling it Celtic world is a bit of an error, because at that time Celtic hadn't been spoken in Galicia for so long that connection would have been long lost. It's only later on academics came up with that one. They didn't have that particular association. It was more the wine trade. Another important element, and it's something I discussed in Bulgaria quite a lot, is that at that particular era, the early Middle Ages particularly, Galicia was the Schwabic kingdom. It was dominated by Schwabs from southern Germany, southwest Germany. Schwaben, it's called now.
Mhm.
So they were the aristocracy, and they were a bulwark of Christianity against the Muslim world that dominated most of Spain. Furthermore, they had a very large Jewish population who were largely artisans. They were the ones who crafted things. And at that era, we suddenly get a development of musical instruments of all types, among them bagpipes with a drone. That's the first evidence we have of bagpipe with drone. It then emerges in the Balkans around the 1500s. I haven't come across any historians in the Balkans, but I came up with this myself and discussed it with friends in Sofia. When the Jews were expelled from Spain in the 1490s, those that were more artisan types were often invited by the Sultan to settle in the Ottoman Empire, and they largely settled in what's now Thessaloniki. It was called Solon at that time. And as soon as they were introduced there, you suddenly get tomatoes and corn and peppers introduced into Balkan cooking, obviously from Spain, and Spain got that from Mexico and Peru. So the Jewish influence on Balkan cooking was magnificent. They came from Spain with all of these, and I think they brought the bagpipe with drone and introduced it to the Balkans, because prior to that, it was simply a bag with, as you get now in the Middle East, with just a double chanter. But you suddenly get a chanter and drone, which had already been developed in northwestern Spain. And an interesting point about that is in the Balkans, it's called gaida. In Spain, it's called gaita.
Right.
But that is the Schwäbic word. Bear in mind that the aristocracy spoke Schwäbisch, Southern German. That is the word for a goat. So I think the term gaita and gaida both come from Old Schwäbic goat. And it's interesting because as I traveled around Europe, looking at different types of bagpipe, I went to places like Poland. I heard pipes in Wielkopolska. So when I first met players from Poland of bagpipes, they were from Wielkopolska. It was two players with the ensemble Mazowsza. And I went and spoke with them afterward. And although the standard word in Polish is for bagpipe in general is dudi, in Wielkopolska they call it kozio. Again, goat, billy goat.
Mm-hmm.
Then I went to Zakopane in the Tatras Mountains, for a folklore festival in which I competed. I told a story and played a bagpipe Kilmore with it and won first prize in a competition of folklore. But the players there called their bagpipe koza, just goat. It's the word for goat. I keep meeting Poles who correct me and say it's kobza. And I was informed by people from Wielkopolska, it's because tourists from Warsaw and Krakow go there for their skiing, and they don't believe that the instrument is called koza, and they've heard that there's an instrument called kobza,
a string instrument,
which is a string instrument, which is more Ukrainian. So I took a Polish course here once, and I remember the teacher correcting me when I referred to it as koza and dudi, and she said, that's not the Polish word. The Polish word for bagpipe is kobza. She wrote it on the board, and all the other students wrote it on. But we were all recommended to use the same Polish dictionary. We all had it. So I quietly looked up bagpipe in there, and it said dudi.
It's an interesting case because this mistake began somewhere maybe in 18th century, that early, with some writers and poets. But even today, even though they speak about the mistake so much every time they present bagpipes somewhere, even today, if you want to buy something connected to bagpipes, it's better to search with kobza rather than with bagpipes because it's still more common among simple people.
But I found the same thing in France because the standard French word is cornemuse. They often use musette, which is not a general term for bagpipe. It's a specific one with bellows, But if you go to the places where they actually play them, the Massif Central, in the northern part, they call it chevrette. In the southern part, cabrette or even cabretta,
Right.
again, goat. Then I go to Hungary, and of course, it's called duda. In Bain's book, it's referred to as duda. So using Russian to get by in Hungarian, because I never managed to get a grasp of Hungarian beyond the real basics. I asked if somebody could find me a duda. Of course he could, says he. And he and his friends came up with a recorder, a whistle.
Oh,
And then I realized that duda is more a general term for anything that you blow and finger. But if you mean specifically a bagpipe, it's kecske duda. And kecske means goat.
oh,
So we find this all over Europe. The word goat is standard for bagpipe. Another wee theory that I have, which is related to the one of the Jewish people going to the Balkans and introducing the gaita, with the bass drone. In Bain's book, it's the first time I encountered Estonia. There's a whole section on Estonian bagpipes and a section on Swedish bagpipes. In both cases, the chanter is the most simple you can imagine, just straight cylindrical board, small holes, single reed in the top, very, very basic. In the case of the ones found in Sweden, in Dalarna province, the drone that goes with it, sometimes two drones, usually one of them is a dummy, but the drone that is with it is in unison with it and is also quite simple and primitive. It doesn't even have a tuning slide. But those in Estonia have a bass drone with tuning slides, a big bit on the end is turned on a lathe, and it looks very much like the old Spanish ones. Now, it occurred to me later on, well, first thing that I found was that although he refers to it as the Estonian bagpipe, when you actually go to Estonia and in Finland, the villages where it was played were coastal or island villages, which were largely Swedish speaking. So within Finland and Estonia, it was the Swedish communities there that tended to play this bagpipe. I don't think exclusively, but there they were. The next thing I learned, delving into that, was that those communities largely worked, where the men would go off to work on trade boats going around the Baltic. And there was a major trade between St. Petersburg and Spain with wine coming through.
mm-hmm. Again.
So I wonder if they got some of these Spanish bagpipes working on the boats and they would play them there. Now, it would have been a long time ago, and the Spanish bagpipe having a conical chanter made of boxwood, it would break easily. And so indeed with the drone. But with the tools that these communities had, it would be very difficult for them to replicate this conical chanter. But they could replicate the bass drone. The broken one, they could put wood on a lathe, even a pole lathe, and make a replica of that. Is it possible that this one found on the coast of Estonia, the various ones found there, they have a drone which looks like it's a replica of one of the Spanish drones, but the chanter that goes with it is like the indigenous Baltic one, which is just a very simple, short, stubby, primitive instrument. Goodness
Flute,
knows.
like a flute. Yeah.
I think it's something that someone ought to pursue.
Very interesting because Belarusian bagpipe culture has undoubtedly something to do with rafting and how they transported wood along rivers. And I wanted to ask you about the connection to Belarusian bagpipes, how you ended up after exploring all those traditions you mentioned. When did you get to Belarusian bagpipes and playing them actually?
Well, um, the Baines book was the first example. I saw the sketch in there, and it was in the museum in Leningrad. In 1974, I got a job with an English theatre company that was touring the world. We went to 15 countries, and we went to the Soviet Union. We flew in actually first to Helsinki. We did a show there, and I went straight to the museum to look close up at the examples they had from the coastal islands of Finland, which had been mentioned in Bain's book. Then when we went to Leningrad, I went straight to the museum there and saw the one from Vitebsk, which had been sketched in Bain's book. Our next stop in the Soviet Union was in Vilnius. And naturally, I went straight to the ethnographic museum there and saw another one there with these carved, upturned wooden bells. So I didn't get a chance to try playing these. I didn't meet any players at that time, but I made note of that, looked as closely as I could at them. Then years later, I was at a folklore festival in the center of France with my own group that I'd trained to do the dancing and songs in the old way. We called it Dromolban. And there was a group from Lithuania there. And this is while it was still the Soviet Union. And they had a player. So I had an opportunity to look at it close up. I hadn't contacted any Belarusian players at that stage. And then later on, there was a Polish girl who came to Edinburgh who played the fiddle. And she had a photograph of a young man from Belarus she'd met busking in Poland. And he had one of these. So I realized it was being played again. Someone was making them again. And then when the internet came about, I found that there is a revival of them going on in Belarus. So when I got the invitation to Hlibokaya, it was a great opportunity. In the meantime, I'd met a young Russian fellow called hold on, yeah,
Alexander?
Alexander.
Alexander. Mm-hmm.
I corresponded with him, and I had a lot of information that he wanted about things like cutting reeds, measuring them, tying in bags. I gave him some pointers on that and so on. And he made a special offer for me to make me a Belarusian bag. And incidentally, his mother's from Belarus.
Okay.
So he does have a connection there.
I didn't know that.
Yes. So he made one for me, which I have. And he also made me one of these. I don't call them Swedish bagpipes. I just call them Nordic, or maybe Baltic would be a good term for them, because I found that they were played in Denmark as well. And bear in mind that southern Sweden for a long time was part of Denmark. So what we call like Gothenburg
Hmm.
was under Danish rule until quite late on in history.
Surprising because sometimes when we mention the regions or countries where there are no bagpipes, we sometimes mention Finland and Denmark and Slovenia, for example. But you already mentioned bagpipes being played in historically in Finland by Swedes and Denmark, which would mean that there were almost no regions in Europe where bagpipes were not played at all.
And see this little one they call the Swedish bagpipe. I find elements of that in artistic works all over Europe. Very small, simple cylindrical chanter, simple drone, which is in unison with the chanter. It seems to be very, very common around the place. Um, if anyone is going to Copenhagen, there is a museum there. I wish I could remember what it's called, but in that museum, they had examples of furniture and furnishings from the homes of Danish aristocrats. And in one of them, in one of the cases, there were some small ivory carvings, and one is of someone playing a bagpipe just like that.
Hmm.
Whether it's indigenous to Denmark or not, I don't know. I did take some photographs of it as close as I could, but it's pretty much exactly the same.
I found a few stamps connected to Denmark in the context of bagpipes, which was also unusual for me and surprising. So maybe they were played there as well. I wanted to go back from Central Eastern Europe. I wanted to go back to Scotland and ask you about the state of bagpiping tradition today. Because usually bagpipers from other countries, when we meet at different festivals and people see us playing, they sometimes use the word the Scottish people, because they associate bagpipes only with the Scottish tradition, and many bagpipers or people in the revival of bagpipes in different regions of Europe, they are very much jealous about the state of things in Scotland and how Scottish bagpipes are exposed as a national pride, and in all possible spheres of life. It's like an emblem, a symbol of Scotland. Um, so I wanted to ask you if there is actually anything to be done with the state like this. I mean, it seems to be a dream world for any bagpipe tradition, but maybe it's not so much the case because you already answering your first question, you already mentioned some drawbacks of such a situation when people study something but for example don't have access to the culture, to the language it comes from. So maybe it's not so perfect as it seems.
I wouldn't say it's perfect. I've become very conscious in my lifetime of the difference between quality and quantity. So because it's more famous, it also becomes diffuse and slightly false in a way. I do think that bagpiping in Scotland is in a very healthy stage because although it's very commercialized, very often militarized, they use it for jazz music and all kinds of things like that. It's way over the top. But at the same time, there are still a lot of traditional classical players, and they're very often the same ones. So, for example, the show that I did last week, because I'm having trouble with my fingers, peripheral neuropathy, I didn't want to play the pibrochs myself. So I got a young player who comes from central Scotland. He doesn't come from a Gaelic tradition at all. He comes from Lesmahago, but I'd heard him a year before in a concert where he was playing classical pibroch and did a very good job of it. So I brought him in to play it. Now, ordinarily, he plays in a pipe band. He plays all kinds of things on it, but he can also play the old classical music. He doesn't know the background of it, so I introduced him to that. So as far as the bagpiping goes in Scotland, it's fine, but it got this prominence, I think, initially because um, at a fairly late stage in history, it still had patronage. So if you go to the Middle Ages in Europe, local aristocrats would patronize musicians, pay for them to become professional. This died out largely in Europe, whereas it carried on in the Northwest Highlands, particularly on the MacDonalds, MacLeods, and Macleans. Other Campbells didn't, sorry, other clans such as the Campbells didn't seem to do that to that extent. But um, then it passed on into the British military, which, because of the British Navy, because they developed a navy that could travel the world, it became prominent, and therefore the English language became prominent. So this association of bagpipes in Scotland comes with the English language, and the English language seems to get everywhere now.
And
So
sometimes they were kind of hijacking even the symbol, like representing Scottish bagpipes as British bagpipes. Am I right?
yes, to some extent. Incidentally, before I forget, I brought a couple of my old collection here, which might be
Great.
interesting. This is my old Habagaida, and it was made on a pole lathe. So it wasn't an electric lathe, it was just a bow switched back and forth. And it's wood they call drian, type of cornel wood, with oxhorn mounts. So, and of course an oxhorn top here.
Mm.
But it's quite interesting because it's all done largely by hand. And I sat in and watched people make these
Oh.
back then. And the finishing wasn't done by sandpaper. I noticed it on the floor of the makers. It was quite dangerous because all this um, uh, dust of wood, which could have gone up in flames. But there was also broken glass.
Mm.
I saw there was a bit of window pane. When the fellow was finishing it off, he simply took a piece of the glass and broke it and used the broken glass to finish the
Okay,
serpent on the chanter.
great. Did you try to bring bagpipes from every region
I,
you went to?
I did. I have a big collection now. This is my Bulgarian Gaida,
Mm-hmm.
which you can see is inlaid with pewter.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I think by the time I was 22 in 1970 and settled down where I still live now, I had Macedonian, uh, Czech, um, uh, Jura Gaida, Kaba Gaida. Very soon after that, I got my first um, so-called Swedish one. It was actually made by a Welshman as a
Mm-hmm.
replica of one he saw in a museum.
Mm-hmm.
And then by the mid 70s, I had a double chantered Central Italian
Mm-hmm.
bagpipe. By the late 70s, I had a,
Zamponia,
well, they don't call it that there. They call it carameda.
Caramella. Mm-hmm.
So the name changes. Zampogna is a sort of standard Italian word, or cornamusa.
Mm-hmm.
But when you actually get to the places where they play them, it's often a different word altogether.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I had quite a big collection from an early period. And bear in mind, when I had this collection, it was living where I do now in a place that's so small I don't have a kitchen. I have to do my cooking either on a coal range on the side of the room, and now I've got a little hot plate
Surrounded by bagpipes.
surrounded by bagpipes. I have no appliances, no car. I don't even have a smartphone, but I have 40 bagpipes,
Isn't that
including all the
beautiful?
Scottish ones. My oldest Scottish one is estimated to have been made around 1810. It's a bellows blown pipe,
Mm-hmm.
um, and it's made of boxwood stained black with printer's ink, and the mounts are some of them are horn, some of them are whale's tooth. I've got an old Scottish set made from the 1870s that's ebony with whale's tooth mounts and brass, which is unusual in modern Scottish bagpipes. And I've got a set of miniature um, Highland pipes, which are boxwood with pewter and horn mounts. But you bear in mind, back in those days, there was only one other person I met for a long time who collected European and old bagpipes, and that was the Welshman called Bob Thomas. He didn't do Eastern European ones, he did Western. So he went for Spain, Italy, and France more than I did. For me, it was easier to get to Slavic countries, but we were great friends. He died some years ago, And in fact, his workshop where he had his collection burned down
Oh,
just
so
before
sad.
his death. And so most of his collection, those that weren't in other people's hands. So I've got the only one left of his Swedish replica ones, which he gave to me in 1976 or thereabouts.
So sad.
Hmm. So
You were kind of predestined to play bagpipes, I guess, speaking about your name, because MacDonald, you mentioned one of the clans who supported
yes,
bagpipers and the culture, and also the last name Reed. Does it have any connection, do you think, to the part of the bagpipe which produces the sound? Reed,
no, no,
reeds,
no, nothing. It's simply the Scots prefer red.
coincidence.
Yeah, but it came originally from Ruach, the Gaelic name, but in an early period when you wrote names down in that area, that particular family, um, they would write them in Scots, the Scottish English, if you like, and they would write them Reid. Now, in standard English, the rule is I before E, except after C. It's strange
Mm.
that, but somebody, a paleographer, friend of mine years ago, explained that to me. She said that in the days of manuscripts, they would have a long mark that they would put over an E. And then they came to movable type when printing came in and you had the little letters put in. They didn't have the long mark anymore. And so they substituted the letter I. And in England, they put the I before the E. And in Scotland, the I came after the E. That's,
To differentiate.
yeah. And it's used with other words like heed and breed and deed. It's
Mm-hmm.
EI in Scotland and IE in
Mm-hmm.
England.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Uh, I thought if you because you were right, and I was also concerned about timing when preparing this interview with you, because you have so many stories to tell. So maybe we will have another episode sometime in the future after you recover after your operation. But we still have some time left, and I wondered, is it enough time, about maybe 20 minutes, to tell a story about bagpipes, which is connected to bagpipe culture? Is there a story which is short enough to be
I'll
told?
try to do a very short one, keep it down to 10 minutes. It's There aren't a lot. The thing is that the stories that I tell are usually um, the equivalent of the German Märchen, like the ones that the Grimm's brothers collected, along those lines, like long dream sequences, and they often involve. I even have the Gaelic version of The Sorcerer's Apprentice and the Gaelic version of Swan Lake. Um, but there is a tale that I got actually from a traveller by the name of Willie McPhee. Now, Willie is part of a community in Scotland that travelled, except in the winter. They would have a place they would live in the winter time, but throughout the rest of the year, they would go often with a cart, rather like gypsies did. And their special skill was repairing metal. So they were called tin cairds because they would use metal for soldering. And caird is an old Gaelic word for a craftsperson. So in Scots, they often call them tinkers from tin caird. But Willie McPhee played small pipes usually, and he never used a valve. He always stopped it with his tongue. And he was on his way home one autumn after a long time of traveling. He had his little bagpipes with him and his little repair kit, but it suddenly started to snow. And it just came down until it was really deep snow, and he was nowhere near home. He was in the hills of south central Scotland. So he couldn't see a house to stop in. So he went to one of the little bridges. You get these little curved bridges of stone because you can go underneath and shelter from the snow. He climbed underneath and found that another traveling man had already stopped there and was dead. So there was his body underneath the bridge. Now, if that ever happens, here's instructions for you. You should pull the body out from under the bridge, bury it in the snow beside the bridge, and then contact the police in the next village you arrive in. Now, Willie had been traveling for a long time, and his boots were so worn through that as he was stepping through the snow, it was gathering it. But when he reached down to pull this body from out under the bridge, it had brand new boots. The poor man had died without even getting to break his boots in. But of course, when you're dead, you don't need boots. So there's no harm in taking them off him and just changing them around. So Willie tried to do that. But he tried and he tried, but the body was so frozen and stiff, he couldn't get the boots off, and the laces just wouldn't go. But of course, when you're dead, you don't need feet either. And he had his little saw for his repairs. So he took the saw and he just carefully sawed them off the through the ankles so that he had the boots with a bit of foot, but it was frozen, so there was no mess. And he took those, he buried the body beside without the feet, beside the bridge, and then he hung the boots around his neck so that he could thaw them out and then put them on. He went to the other side of the bridge, but then he saw a light in the distance, and it was a small farmhouse. So he went to the house, and he saw inside there was a woman and a man about to eat a big meal. A goose, they had roast potatoes, and a bottle of whiskey. So Willie chopped on the door. The woman comes to the door and she says, "What do you want?" He says, "I'm a piper. Would you like some music? I could play for you while you, and if you would share some supper with me, give me a place to sleep for the night." The woman says, "No, we don't want that here. You're a tinker, just go away." And she shut the door. He looked again in the window and there was plenty of food there. So he chopped on the door again. And this time the man came to the door and Willie says to him, "Listen, I'm sorry, but I know you can't share your food, but the snow is getting very deep. Is there somewhere I can sleep here? Just some shelter?" And the man says, "Oh, all right. If you go round the back, we've got a shed there with a cow in it. You could sleep in the hay." So Willie said, "All right." And he went round the back and he found, indeed, there was a pretty scrawny cow in there and a bit of hay, but it was warm enough. And he took off his coat and made a bed. But of course, he had those frozen boots with the feet inside, and he had to thaw them out by morning. So he put them in front of the cow's mouth so its breath would help to melt the frozen feet. And he went to sleep. But he slept too long. It was so warm in there. He was awakened in the morning by the sound of the woman coming in with her pail and her stool. She suddenly sat down next to the cow, and then she screamed and threw the bucket and said, "My God, the cow's eaten the piper. The cow has eaten the piper. There's nothing left of him but his feet." But Willie didn't want to frighten them. She ran to get her husband. So he hadn't guessed it. He was still just in his overcoat in the hay. So he pulled out his little miniature bagpipe and started to play. The man shouted out, "My God, that's his ghost coming to get us. We're out of here." And they ran off and he never saw them again. So Willie went back into the house. They'd left the door open. There was plenty of goose and potatoes and whiskey left over from the night before, and he had himself a fine meal, and he also got himself a beautiful new pair of boots.
Great job for the piper.
Willie told me this when I was young, and I was astonished that this had happened to him. And then I found out later it's a classical folk tale.
Beautiful, beautiful. I was thinking if there is an anthology of stories like that across Europe. You know, there are so many stories, and this is how also my interest in bagpipes began, actually, because I'm not so much a musician as my background is more like literature and things connected with texts. So I studied different stories in the meantime, and have always wondered whether there is a book about bagpipes from, from Lisbon to Minsk.
Well, I heard a wonderful tale in central France about a fellow being followed by a wolf. where he took his sash off and let it drag behind, and he played his bagpipe to get home.
This story also is in close to Hlibokaya, the festival you came
Oh,
to in
okay.
Belarus, yes, but
And
with a fiddle player.
I got two stories about bagpipe in Slovakia. One of them was a genuine tale from a woman I met there, and she said that when her wedding was held, which was decades ago, it had always been the tradition in that part of Slovakia you should have a bagpipe player, but they didn't know anyone. They just didn't know of any bagpipe players in the area. So they just went ahead with the wedding and didn't have a bagpiper. But they'd started the wedding, and suddenly an old man, nobody knew who he was, just arrived there with an overcoat, and he had a bagpipe. And he started playing. And everyone was very excited. They started dancing to this. And this went on for a long time, and people were getting drunk. And then suddenly he just disappeared. And they never saw him again. And no one ever figured out who he was or where he came from.
Right. Uh, Thank you, James, a lot for this wonderful conversation interview. And I hope, as I mentioned, we will have a sequel to this sometime in
Okay,
the future. So good luck with everything, and thank you very much once again.
okay, dziękuję. Hey,
Дякую.
bye bye for
Велике
now.
дякую.